So there are a number of changes which are introduced by the bill which will impact on PECR, relating to data breach notification, the removal of consent for some cookies, for example, emergency assistance and location, and also cookies that optimise content, etc. There's also the extension of soft opt-in for charitable organisations, but the big change, and something we'll be talking about today, is the proposed increase in fines to align with the GDPR. So obviously for marketing, the stakes are about to get a lot higher. And so for today's session, we're going to be covering current rules on marketing and also looking at enforcement action going forward. So introducing the speakers today. So we have Claire Saunders, who is our PSL. She's going to be talking about PECR terms, consent and the beloved soft opt-in, refer a friend marketing, and how to manage and use your marketing lists compliantly, I might add. We then have Lisa Thorp, who's our compliance director. She's going to be providing you with an overview of loyalty schemes and the data protection considerations if your organisation is either considering introducing or promoting a loyalty scheme. Then finally, last but not least, we have Alison Deighton, who's co-founder and director of Hello DPO. And Alison will be providing a super interesting oversight of historic ICO enforcement action in relation to marketing, and will be considering how historic trends might be interpreted to give us an insight into potential future marketing fines by the ICO. So Claire, I'm just going to hand over to you to start the session.
I am going to start off with taking you through some key terms under the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations. So first of all, importantly, direct marketing. This definition is taken from the Data Protection Act 2018, and it's the communication by whatever means of advertising or marketing material which is directed to particular individuals. Note the sort of emphasis on the last part here. So we're not talking about handing out leaflets, we're not talking about billboard advertising, it's directed to particular individuals. It does include not-for-profit marketing, so it doesn't have to have that commercial aim. And just a couple of points to note, Lisa will talk later about sort of the lines between service messages and marketing and how not to blur them. And just a quick note that branding and logos and strap lines, generally speaking, would be not considered marketing, but obviously depending on how you use them, there are ways that you can stray into that territory, which obviously we want to avoid. Next up, we have electronic mail. Now, this is a term which is tech neutral and broad, which is a sort of a deliberate move. And to be honest with you, probably worked pretty well considering this is 2003 and we're now 2025. So it's any text, voice, sound or image message sent over a public communications network which can be stored in the network or in the recipient's terminal until they come to collect it. There are rules for sort of fax and telephone. I'm not going to go into those today. I'd be relatively surprised, I think, if people are doing fax marketing, but maybe you can correct me later in the Q&As. What we're looking at here is things like emails, texts, picture messages, video messages, voicemails, messages that you send in apps, or direct messages via social media. Now, the key thing, I think, in terms of this is the fact that these messages are stored until you collect them. So I think the social media example is quite a good one to kind of distinguish that something which is put in someone's feed will not be stored there until they come to look at it. Whereas if you send a direct message to them into their inbox, that message will remain there until the individual collects it. And so that's what we're talking about here with electronic mail. Unsolicited marketing. Now, this distinction is that basically solicited marketing is when a person has come to you and said, please, will you send me your marketing? I mean, I guess it does happen sometimes, but let's say for the majority of the time, the marketing that is being done is unsolicited marketing. That's not to say that you can't do it, but you have to follow the rules when you're doing it. So even if someone's opted into your marketing, it's still considered unsolicited because they didn't actively request it. Subscribers. Subscribers under PECR. The reason we're talking about subscribers is obviously we're PECR here, so it's not GDPR, so it's not necessarily personal data. So this will apply even if you don't know the names of the individual you're sending to. You might have an email address which doesn't have a sort of a specific name attached to it. We break down subscribers into two types: corporate subscribers and individual subscribers. Some of the electronic mails rules don't apply to corporate subscribers. They only apply to individuals. Just for quick reference, individuals also include sole traders and some partnerships, so not LLPs. A subscriber is really the person on the invoice for the internet, basically, is a good way of kind of looking at it. So, for example, with your employment email addresses, there'll be like the employer rather than the individual themselves. Next up, senders and instigators. Even if you engage someone else to do your marketing for you. We're not talking about a sort of a webmail platform here, but engaging someone else either informally or formally to do marketing for you, you will still be considered the instigator of the marketing. And the ICO says that it usually takes action against the instigator. But if you are obviously formally using somebody to send your marketing, obviously, and we got personal data involved, then you will need to ensure that you are complying with the rules in relation to someone processing personal data for you, if that's their capacity. Moving on to look at the two sort of ways in which we can send this electronic mail marketing, the basis on which we can send them. So we have consent and the soft opt-in, which are the two sort of different ways it can be done and have different requirements. So first of all, looking at consent. Just note before that we said, so consent is not required for corporate subscribers. However, when you're speaking to corporate subscribers, you must not disguise or conceal your identity when you're sending marketing to them, and you have to give a valid address for the business to opt out or unsubscribe to the messages. And just to note, if you are using personal data for corporate subscribers, which you may well be, because it may well be that the email address is name at whatever company, then you will need to obviously comply with all the rules in terms of personal data processing. But you may be able to consider legitimate interests in this context. It's something that you have to look into. And another reminder that sole traders and partnerships, some partnerships are classed as individuals. The standard of consent, GDPR standard consent, we look at whether the consent's been freely given. So genuine choice and control. We can't say you must sign up to the marketing in order to get this service. It needs to be unbundled, so it can't be mixed in with other terms and conditions. Part of, I think, this free choice is that you need to know that you're consenting to it. It needs to be clear. It needs to be easy to understand. It needs to be prominent. We can't hide this from people. Also, we need to be sure that if people don't consent, that they're not treated in a detrimental way in comparison to those who do consent to marketing. Specific and informed, we need to be granular with it. Being vague is going to get you nowhere. People need to know what they are consenting to. So they need to know who. So that's you as a controller and any third-party controllers who are going to rely on that consent. They need to be stated. What we need to have the processing operations broken down unless they're sort of interdependent. I think it does have this sense of you do have to balance in the same way with transparency, that you are making sure that this is information which is useful to people, and it's striking that balance between being frank with people but also making sure they can understand it. Why purposes and separate purposes, and make sure the consent is again granular, and we don't sort of generally say consent to direct marketing. That doesn't help anyone because they just don't know what the kind of marketing they might be receiving. So it's separate from transparency, this consent, because this is PECR, not GDPR, but you can use some of the same layered notices just in time to help you get those points across. Looking then at the unambiguous indications, so the individual needs to give an unambiguous indication of consent. So that can be a statement or action, it can be oral or written. It has to just be a deliberate action here, really. Explicit consent, which will be necessary for special category data. It needs a clear affirmative statement. Now the ICO has said there's no specific definition of it, and it doesn't necessarily mean much more than the usual high standard of consent. There has to be a statement, either oral or written, but it doesn't have to be in the individual's own words. So it could end up being a ticking of the box. So you just need to be extra careful when, you know, special category data is being used. General points: you can't seek consent. So you can't email someone and say, please can give us consent to the marketing, because that is in of itself marketing. Also, we must be aware that consent doesn't evolve. You need to be careful of drift, of, you know, starting off with one idea about what the marketing you're doing is, and that, you know, people getting wonderful ideas and that developing over time, but not being reflected in those consent statements. So we need to make sure that we keep them under review to make sure they're relevant. Separate consents for different modes of communication. So we, you know, SMS, just because they've agreed to that doesn't mean they would agree to having an email. Doesn't transfer between addresses as well. So, you know, just because John Smith at Google has agreed doesn't mean John Smith at Yahoo has agreed. You need to have separate consents. Consent, we should obviously always keep a very clear record of who's consented, and also people who haven't consented or have opted out, obviously, in suppression lists. Withdrawal of consent needs to be easy, it needs to be free, it needs to be just very simple to do. And I think people have got a lot better at that. I remember at the initial sort of stages that you sort of click through multiple screens. You have to sort of sign up to an account, but, you know, ideally one click is definitely getting a lot better. Also, consent doesn't last forever. You need to have a real think about how long that consent's going to be valid for, at what point it needs to be refreshed, and the kind of expectations of people in respect to that. Now, looking at the soft opt-in. The soft opt-in, as Jenai said, beloved, which I think is true, because I feel like, you know, in a world where we're following lots of strict rules, it does feel like a little bit of a nice thing to have. And what is a soft opt-in? Well, it is, as I said, an alternative to consent for this sort of electronic mail marketing, where the specific requirements can be fulfilled. There are 4 requirements, and we need to make sure that all 4 are being complied with. The first one is that you have obtained the contact details. Now, these have to be obtained from the individual directly. So the fact that they're publicly available doesn't mean that they've been obtained. That's publicly available is not having obtained them from the individual. It can only be the entity that obtained the details. So if you're part of a group, other group companies can't use those details when one of their other group companies has obtained them. You need to be aware that if there was a situation where there's a purchase or purchase of goods and services that involves lots of different entities, you need to make sure that your role in it is prominent, and that the people who are signing up realise that you will be sending the marketing, as well as maybe some other people involved in that sale, because it just goes from, you know, if it's unexpected, it's likely to be unwelcome. People need to know what's going on. Second point, in the course of a sale or negotiation of a sale of goods or services. So I think in the course of sale, quite obvious really. Negotiation of a sale of goods or services, slightly more grey area. So firstly, just to say, there has to be some sort of inquiry relating to purchase of the products or the services. So it can't just be a general inquiry. So if you've got an employment inquiry or inquiry just generally about the business, that's not enough. And it can't be passive behaviour, sort of scrolling the website. You know, it needs to be some kind of positive action on the individual's behalf. Also, just to mention that free trials can be one of those types of inquiries, because it's indicating an intention and interest in the service or product itself. Thirdly, similar products and services. When we're talking about similar products and services, it's your similar products and services, again, not other group company products and services. And when considering what is similar, I mean, again, this is where we are slightly grey. You might have a situation where you, for example, a supermarket, buy some bananas, then, you know, other food related items may make sense. But if that supermarket decides to go into selling clothes, hasn't previously, and advertises clothes to people, there might be a question over whether that is similar products and services. Whereas in another situation where, it's a big supermarket with an established clothes sales and everybody knows about this, it's sort of, again, it's about sort of expectation. What would people reasonably expect? But it's definitely something to consider quite carefully. Opportunity to opt out. People should be given the opportunity to opt out at the time and in every subsequent communication. So this involves, a sort of an element of automation. You need to make sure that that's in the bottom of the email or whatever, that the opt-out is there and it's easy to do. It's free of charge. It needs to be clear as well. Again, we can't try and hide from this. We need to be able to make sure that people can exercise their rights to opt out if they want to. Refer a friend. Acknowledged by the ICO that, it can be quite an effective marketing tool. It's, advantageous for everyone in the best situation, the business, the referrer and the referee. We do need to be careful because encouraging someone to send marketing by electronic mail, potentially with incentive, but potentially not, or encouraging them to do that, consent would be required. We can't do soft opt-in because we haven't got the details of the family or friend ourselves. We didn't get them directly, so we have to rely on consent. And we can't get consent because we can't get consent from somebody we have no contact with. How do we potentially try and navigate that? We need to think about how we are encouraging people to share that kind of information. So, for example, it could be like a code, like an offer code, and we need to be neutral. We know creating emails or messages to forward on. Don't encourage, not the mentioning of, if you want to email this to, or if you want to, forward this text, is definitely not going to be compatible. The ICO gives an example of if you have, a customer portal, so your customer can log into their customer account, and then we'll get this code, and it's just a collection of letters and numbers or whatever. And say, you may share this with anyone you think would be interested, but we don't say how to make other people aware. And so the decision then rests with the person who is referring to decide how to send those messages. Okay, looking then at managing and using marketing lists. So if you are buying in details of people to market to, and we're looking at individual subscribers here, using those lists, you need to do your due diligence. You can't simply take it as read that they are fine to use without doing the background checks. PECR requires background checks, and they kind of overlap somewhat with what's required under GDPR. So you need to think, as I'll say just at the end, that every time we're looking at this, we need to think, are we using personal data or are we not? Because if we're using personal data, we also need to think about the GDPR rules. But PECR wise, we need to look to see whether there's valid consent obtained, and is there a record of that consent? You should be obtaining a record of that consent. When and how was that consent obtained? Is it old? Is it stale? Is it, and again, the how sort of covers what they were told and goes into the sort of valid consent point. Does it cover what the marketing that you'll be doing? Obviously that's necessary. And did it include your information so they know that you will be marketing to them? And what were they told? So as I said, it does kind of overlap a bit with the information you might require for a GDPR exercise when you're buying in data, although sometimes the emphasis is slightly different. For example, you might need to look at sort of individual, like how individual rights are going to be exercised, what privacy information was given to them when it's using personal data, and then obviously where the data was obtained from, there are accuracy issues if it's personal data. So I think it's important to know whether we're personal data or not, and we need to look at both, either side, and make sure that we're doing all the due diligence we need to. Also, should make sure that the consent covers the method of marketing that you're going to be using. So if it's SMS, then you need to make sure that you've got consent for SMS, email, etc. Finally, just looking at a couple of final points, PECR and GDPR sit alongside. So if the information in your electronic mail marketing will be covered by PECR, but could also be covered by GDPR. And to be honest with you, in a lot of cases will be. So we need to be looking at all of the normal rules for processing personal data, such as lawful basis, transparency, individual rights, etc. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at marketing, we really are covering both if we need to. I just wanted to make a brief mention, obviously the other part of PECR being cookies and similar technologies, and just drawing your attention to the new ICO guidance because of the sort of proliferation of cookieless technologies, and so it gives greater guidance on how those are covered. And obviously there will be a good deal of attention on cookies because the ICO has them in their sites and has generally been looking at UK websites. Telephone and fax, I did mention earlier, they do have separate requirements which under PECR which you will need to look into if you're looking at marketing in those ways. And also the EU regime. So the EU regime is different. There was a proposal for a regulation for a privacy electronic communications regulation, but it has actually been dropped just recently. And there's some talk about maybe being a digital advertising act. When you're working under the EU regime, obviously the directive applies in the national law of the country, the jurisdiction that you're working in will apply. And with that, I'll hand you over to Lisa.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about loyalty schemes and kind of their great marketing tools. But just before we do that, just to help me see how popular loyalty schemes are, we're just going to do a quick poll to see who has a loyalty scheme, who kind of collects points for coffees, that kind of thing. So hopefully a poll's going to pop up and you can just tick yes or no.
So we have 87% said yes and 13% said no. Lisa's prolific at loyalty schemes, and there's not a scheme that she's not part of. So
yes, so again, it does prove my point that this is a good one to chat about because they are very popular for both individuals and organisations. So as we've just mentioned, loyalty schemes are a great way for retailers, hospitality and kind of restaurants to retain their customers and to increase their sales by kind of getting people to points mean prizes to spend. So there's lots of different ways that organisations can reward their loyal customers. You can have a collection of points that equal a cash value. So for every kind of £1 you spend, you might get 4 points, which will then allude to money off in that store. Free products if you have a certain spend and threshold. So again, if you buy a certain amount of coffees, you might get 1 free. Other times you might get access to selected offers and competitions as well if you're kind of in the club, and sometimes there'll be special pricing for loyalty members. So there might be, if you have a loyalty scheme, you may get a certain discount on a particular weekend. So as well as sort of collecting all these kind of spending, there's lots of personal data that people can collect from loyalty schemes as well. So they're a great way. So people will typically give their name, their date of birth, email addresses. You'll be able to have a look at their kind of transaction and spending habits as well. So we really do need to consider all areas of data protection. I know we're kind of focusing on marketing at the moment, but they do hoard quite a lot of data on individuals as well. So if we're going to send marketing from our loyalty schemes, can we do that? I suppose that's the question. A loyalty programme will fall into the scope of direct marketing because, as Claire's mentioned, you're kind of going out there, you're targeting individuals. And ultimately, by having a loyalty scheme, you're encouraging people to spend with your brand, with your sort of products as well. So that's absolutely going to be marketing. So this means that if you're emailing any emails that you send to your customers promoting your loyalty scheme, whether that is they're already kind of existing and they're in the scheme, or you want to kind of let them know about your loyalty scheme, that is going to fall under PECR, and you will need to either have marketing permissions or whether you can, as Claire's mentioned, rely on the soft opt-in exemption under PECR. You also have to be careful that individuals can't sort of force somebody to sign up for marketing to be able to sign up for the loyalty scheme as well. They should be able to have their kind of loyalty and not receive marketing from you as well. So that's another key point on your sort of sign up journey, that people don't necessarily feel forced to have marketing just to be able to enjoy the benefits of your loyalty scheme. Again, looking at genuine choice, you should always give an individual a genuine choice to sign up for their loyalty scheme. So again, you're not going to sort of prevent them from coming into your and spending in your organisation if they don't have a loyalty scheme. Think about how people can sign up. So is there kind of pop-ups on your websites? Are you going to kind of offer them through during the sales process, maybe posters advertising them within kind of stores or coffee shops? Look at where you're targeting individuals. You may want to put adverts onto people's news feeds on social media as well. But again, you need to just be careful of how you're sort of targeting people, and you don't look as if they're not signed up for marketing. You're not kind of directly sending them a marketing message around your loyalty scheme. When somebody's signing up for a loyalty scheme, just to kind of bring in a little bit of GDPR, you should always provide them with privacy notices, which will explain how the loyalty scheme works, how you're collecting and processing their data. And of course, if you are signing them up for marketing for a loyalty scheme, we need to have that really clear wording about signing up in different ways, as Claire's talked about earlier as well. There is service messages versus marketing, and then this can always be a bit of a grey area with people, again, as Claire mentioned, because one tiny line in your service email can be enough to spark a complaint and bring you into the scope of marketing. So when you have a loyalty scheme, you could say that they've signed up to terms and conditions, they're agreeing to make certain purchases, you're agreeing to offer them the kind of promised loyalty. So you can say sort of signing up to the loyalty scheme is contractual necessity. Marketing sits slightly out of that because it's not necessary in the contract to send them marketing. As part of these terms and conditions, you will be required to send maybe statements, allow people maybe to go into their app and see how many points they've earned. So you really need to let them know how they're kind of achieving with their loyalty scheme. So that is totally fine to be sending out emails to people to say, you have this many stamps, or you've achieved a free coffee, or you've got a £5 voucher coming in the post, and that doesn't class as marketing. We have to be careful. They need to be very transactional and very neutral in tone if somebody hasn't signed up for marketing. So it would need to be, hey, here's your £5 voucher that you've earned, or you've earned a free coffee. What we shouldn't be doing if somebody hasn't signed up for marketing is giving them the kind of offer of what their money is, but then saying, have you thought about buying this? Or here's some links of our new season's items that you could spend your money on, that looks as though you are kind of promoting them to spend the money. Likewise, if you say to somebody, you've won a free coffee, or you've been rewarded a free coffee, we're not going to kind of fill that with pictures of cakes to encourage them to come in and buy a cake with their free coffee. So we need to be very careful. We are technically, I mean, we're giving them an option to come into our shops and spend money. So, you know, we're already doing that, but we can't sort of make it fancy and all marketing. So just think about the type of messages that you're sending out. There will be a great cohort of people though, and these are your ideal ones that have signed up for loyalty, love your brand, are always coming in and shopping, and have also signed up for marketing as well. So of course we don't want to miss out on promoting to these type of people, because these are the ones that we really want to promote, because we know they're going to come in and spend. So you may find in your marketing, and if your CRM has the ability to do this, this is great, where you can actually distinguish between the people that have signed up for loyalty and marketing and those that have just signed up for loyalty. And you may want to send out different communications, because of course we want to be sort of targeting those people and letting them who want marketing. We want to be able to send them marketing information with their transactional stuff. Very carefully, though, you need to make sure that those are segmented. You know exactly the right people. You're not going to accidentally send out a whole host of marketing to people who have not signed up for it as well. So if you are going to do that, it is great, but you just need to really make sure that your kind of lists have been double checked and you've done all your due diligence, so the right people get the right messages. So I'm just going to give you just a few tips just to kind of recap and sort of remember with loyalty schemes. Is always give people a genuine choice for a loyalty scheme. It's not a condition of service. It's an added bonus that people can kind of sign up for. Again, you can't make marketing a condition of a loyalty scheme as well. So people are allowed to come in and kind of benefit from the loyalty scheme and spend without having the additional marketing. You need to ensure that your privacy notice contains all information relating to loyalty schemes, and any kind of marketing sign up information is very clear and sort of follows the rules that Claire mentioned earlier. If you're sending your service messages, very transactional, very neutral in tone, just kind of telling them how they've sort of going with their reward scheme and what they're sort of entitled to. You can't ask people. So let's say if you've never done a loyalty scheme before and you decide that you're going to introduce one, you can't email your customers who are on your database without marketing permissions to invite them to join the loyalty scheme. So that's where we've kind of talked about maybe you want to put posters up in your stores or in kind of retail units to promote that, or put them on kind of news feeds, so you can't directly go to people who haven't signed up for marketing to ask them to join your loyalty scheme. If you're using your loyalty scheme for additional information, so that would be to look at your kind of transactional spend to see who your top customers are, to see how people are spending, which may then go on to promote and have a look at your marketing. You could be looking at your profile and your customers. Then you're going to need to look to do data protection impact assessments as well. So a loyalty scheme could, depending on what you're doing, fall into data protection, sort of needing a data protection impact assessment as well.
That's really great, Lisa. At the end, we're going to have a special poll as to how much money I've saved since Lisa convinced me to sign up to all of the schemes. We'll do that right at the end, and you can see how much money it's worth. I think it's actually quite good because you're shopping there anyway, so you may as well benefit and then support the businesses. So, okay, so next we have Alison.
Thank you. I'm going to be having a look at ICO enforcement actions, and specifically the enforcement actions that have been brought in relation to marketing. So before I dig into some of the details, just a quick reminder about what the potential ICO enforcement actions are. And these are set out here kind of in descending order of harshness. So the top one there is monetary penalty notices, so that's fines. We're in the position now with marketing because the marketing rules have been there for a very long time. There's been lots of guidance out there where if you are in serious breach of the marketing rules, you're very likely to be in line for a monetary penalty notice. The ICO gets a lot of complaints about marketing and they will take action to prevent it from happening. There's a real risk of fines if you get marketing wrong. The next one there is enforcement notices. So this is where the ICO sends you a notice saying you must stop doing this or you must do this within a certain time frame. And so very often with marketing enforcement, you will get a fine and you will get an enforcement notice. So it's usually saying stop sending these emails or stop doing these marketing calls, and here's your fine. The next one is information notice. So this is really when the ICO is investigating and wants to find out what you are doing. They might have had some complaints, but they want to dig into exactly the extent of your marketing. And so then they can serve a notice requiring certain information within a certain time frame. And obviously you have a legal obligation to cooperate with those notices. And then the last one is informal action. So if you do have an issue with marketing, this is the one you want to fall into. So this is what will happen if you've just made a mistake. So if you actually have a pretty compliant marketing system, but say your unsubscribe link just fell off your system for a few weeks and you didn't notice for a while. If it's something relatively minor like that and you get a complaint and you can demonstrate that it was just a technical error that you fixed as soon as you found out about it, then you'll just get a sort of ticking off or a yes, okay, we're happy you've sorted that out now, and it won't escalate to any of the others. But what can happen is that if you get one complaint, that can mean that they start asking questions and then they find out about other things and then it escalates into something a lot more difficult. So those are all the potential actions that can be taken. So I'm going to have a look at some of the trends in ICO fines, particularly in relation to marketing. So looking at the sectors that have been fined in the last couple of years, the different channels of marketing and the relative fines that come across the different channels. And then also the number and amounts of fines we've seen over the last couple of years, and really looking at this with a view to seeing, well, if the marketing fines are going up in line with GDPR level of fines, then obviously it's important to know where those fines are likely to land and what they might look like. So the first one I'm going to look at is the sectors. So over the last couple of years, these are the different sectors that have received marketing fines. So there are a total in 2023, there were 20 fines for marketing, and in 2024, there were 15, but they were in very similar sectors across those 2 years. So the first one there is the marketing sector. So this is agencies or platforms that their business is to send out marketing on behalf of other people. So I think you probably expect them to be in the mix here for receiving marketing fines. Then the next one is home improvements. That is people saying, do you want us to like redo your drive? Do you need double glazing? That sort of activity. The third one is financial services. This is an interesting one. This is not big financial, so this is not banks and big providers who are getting these fines. This is sort of debt management advisory businesses, insurance, pension kind of advisors, brokers, that sort of smaller, maybe intermediary type business or advisory business. And that was the largest sector over the last couple of years, particular focus last year on that. This white goods one, I didn't know how else to describe this, but this is people sort of trying to sell warranties or repair services for white goods in your home. That was the sort of similar to the marketing sector in terms of numbers of fines. Then we had a few for energy in 2023, and that was really, again, energy brokers, people encouraging you to try to switch energy providers. And then there were a few others in different sectors as well. But the thing to take from this is that in the case of home improvements, the financial services, particularly the debt management advisory piece and the white goods, those three, which together make up quite a bulk of the fines, were sectors where the ICO decided to proactively investigate those sectors because they were seeing complaints coming through in relation to those sectors. If you have a marketing team who say, oh, it's okay, everybody else is doing this, which we hear quite a lot. I don't know if you get that, but it's fine. All our competitors are doing it. If that's in breach of the marketing rules and all your competitors are doing it, then that is highly likely to get on the list of the ICO sectors for investigation, and then highly likely to result in sort of fines in that sector over a period. Interesting to see that they definitely are picking up on particular sectors where they're getting the complaints and then focusing their enforcement activities in those sectors. Then before we move on to the next slide, we're going to do a quick poll. So the poll is around which channel do you think has had the most fines in the last 2 years? So marketing calls, emails, or SMS. So we've got mixed, quite an even sort of response between calls and emails at the moment, SMS lagging behind, but calls are at the top there. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, calls are by far the highest number of fines. So we've got sort of like, I think it's probably about 23 or 24 of those 35 fines related to calls. There was actually only one in the last 2 years that's solely related to emails. There were a few that were both emails and SMS, and then a few more that were SMS. So marketing calls, I think, generate the most complaints, and you can understand that because it is super irritating because you pick up the phone, you don't know who it is, and then you get an annoying marketing call and it's distracted you from whatever it is you're doing. Emails, I think that's an interesting one. I think that's indicative of the fact that people have sorted out emailing marketing consent a lot better than it used to be and are aware that there have been loads of fines in that area. So I think that's made the people more compliant. And also it's relatively easy to have your unsubscribe on there, and people can unsubscribe from the marketing. So maybe they're less likely to complain about receiving the emails if you've got your unsubscribe on there. But this is clear that if you're doing marketing calls, this is a really hot area for enforcement action. And so you need to make sure you're doing that in a compliant way. Now, we didn't go through those rules in detail earlier because the vast majority of the organisations we work with are using emails as their primary marketing channel, not calls. But if you are doing calls, you don't need to have prior consent unless you're in some very specific sectors. So the general rule is that you just must not contact people who are listed on the telephone preference service unless you can demonstrate you do have a valid GDPR valid consent to telephone market to them. Most of those who got those marketing fines were just calling people without having checked the telephone preference service, without being able to show they had a valid consent. But that's definitely an area, if your business is doing that, make sure you know that that's being done in a compliant way. So those are the sort of fines by sector and channel over the last couple of years. Going to look now just at the sort of range of when these fines are being imposed. So you can see that there's a bit of a trend over the last couple of years that there's a spike sort of after the summer, and before year end. So it seems to be that the sort of casework, you know, people want to get it finalised and sorted by the end of the year when they get back from the summer break, maybe. I did initially ask ChatGPT to prepare some charts on this, and it had incredibly interesting charts that showed for the last 3 years almost identical enforcement action. But then when I checked it against the actual fines imposed, turned out it was all a load of rubbish. And so don't rely on ChatGPT for this sort of stuff. So this is quite interesting that there's that little spike each year in the last couple of years after the summer, but it's quite evenly spread apart from that over the year in terms of the enforcement activity. And then in terms of the amount of fines, that again reflects really the numbers of fines in the previous month. So obviously that September spike, there were a lot more fines in that month, and so that goes up to £800,000 of marketing fines in September for 2023. It is interesting that in 2024 the average amount of fines went up. So in 2023, although there were more fines, the average amount of the fine was lower than it was in 2024. So in 23, there was nothing over 200,000 for marketing fines. But in 2024, I think nearly a third of the fines were over £200,000. So there is an increase in the actual average amount of the fine over that time. The average over the last 2 years for marketing fines was £120,000, which if you're a relatively small business is not an insignificant amount. That is 24% of the current maximum fine of £500,000. So if you were to just extrapolate that, under the new bill, the fines for marketing will align with GDPR. So the maximum fine would end up being 17 million or 4% of turnover, whichever is the higher. So if you took the 24% of that, that would equate to 4.08 million. So that's obviously a massive increase in the potential for the fines that could be imposed. I think turnover will be a key factor because the ICO generally doesn't want to fine a business to put them out of business. So they do look at your financial situation to determine how much to fine. So I think larger organisations, if they are found to be in breach, should definitely be expecting significantly larger fines than we've seen historically. I think for the smaller businesses, they're already getting quite hefty fines when you compare it to their turnover. So I don't necessarily think for the smaller businesses, we're going to see a massive increase. And most of the fines in the last couple of years have tended to be on smaller, perhaps less reputable businesses who have been sending out marketing in breach of the rules. So it's definitely an area we need to make sure you're on top of, because that risk factor is a lot bigger, and make sure you're focusing on the calls if you're doing any marketing calls, because we would expect that there will continue to be lots of complaints about the calls into the ICO, and they'll therefore take action accordingly.
Thank you, Alison. So we've now got the QA. There's a QA function at the top of your screen, or there should be, where you can click QA and ask the question. Whilst people are doing that, I do have a question for Alison. Would you like to know how much Lisa has saved me? She has badgered me into signing up for free coffees and boasts about how much money she saves. And so I did actually count before this webinar how much she has saved in coffee. So I'm going to launch this now. And this is a genuine truth. So this is since January. So we have January to March. So that's 2 full months. So what's that? 9 weeks. How much has Lisa saved me by convincing me to sign up? And this doesn't include cake as well. It's actually, everyone's right, it's actually more than £30 she's saved me. I am not kidding. So and it supports businesses that you like. So it does pay to be loyal. And there's a lot of other things that you can sign up to for discounts. And when you scan your card, it reduces your prices. So I definitely think loyalty schemes are a really good way for people to maintain that relationship with their customers, definitely. So if nobody else has got a question, I do have a question. It kind of goes back to what Claire touched on at the beginning, where we talked about the issue with consent and scope creep. So Alison, I was wondering if you could give us some tips on how best to word a consent compliantly. So if an organisation knows that they're going to be doing something or potentially will in the future, is there a way, or what's the best way to draft the consent where we're trying to collect that information
I think there are two things to bear in mind. One is if you just think you may do it in the future, but you've no immediate plans to do it, then I don't include it in your consent, because that won't remain valid for long enough to then rely on it when you come to that point. So if you are thinking, oh, we might do it next year, but you don't do it for 12 months from the time when you've collected the consent, it's highly unlikely that consent would still be valid by the time you get to it. So it does need to be things you know you're going to do pretty imminently. If you give people options as to how they want to hear from you, even if you're not doing all of them right now, that could help. But again, it still needs to be in the relatively near future. Have that regular review process. So we've got your consents now. If you then look at it, in 6 months, 12 months and in 18 months, you can check whether that's still matching up with what you're doing. And if you've got consent from people and you want to expand it, you can go out to those people and see if they're happy to receive further marketing in other ways. So just make sure you've got them regularly under review. I can see there's one question in the chat in the Q&A about mobile apps. So if you have a mobile app for customers that includes a loyalty scheme for coffees purchased, would you require the app user to opt in or out to receive promotional related app pop-up notifications if the app user has the ability to switch off any pop-up notifications from the app under the app settings? I think what we're getting at there is, would you be able to send sort of marketing through the app to people who are in the loyalty scheme without sort of getting a specific consent for it, if they've got that ability to decide within their app settings whether or not they receive notifications? The issue for that will be to check, is it caught by the PECR electronic mail rules in terms of, is that notification going to be stored there until they come and collect it? In which case you would technically need the prior consent, so you would have needed the consent in order to send those sort of notifications for marketing purposes in the first place. And then they could obviously revoke that at any point by changing their settings at a later time. I don't know if Claire or Lisa has anything else to add to that.
No, and I think again it's saying that somebody could go in and have the loyalty and looking at the difference, that they could have the kind of pop-ups from the app, but they might not necessarily have signed up for email marketing as well to kind of promote your loyalty scheme. So again, looking to see what an individual is signing up for and being quite granular with your marketing. So do you want to kind of receive the pop-ups? Do you want to receive marketing? Because again, I've signed up for a number of apps with loyalty schemes, but I don't necessarily then sign up to have the email marketing around the loyalty, or in particular the brand as a whole as well. It might not necessarily be their marketing, it might be their loyalty, there might be other promotions as well. So I think it's just looking at what we're telling individuals, and as Alison said, does it kind of fall under that PECR rule?
I think as well, this is an area that gets kind of neglected within apps, that people don't necessarily think of marketing consent in that environment. And so the obvious place to get that consent, if you need it, would be obviously when people download the app and they're going through all those settings. So like, do you want to enable notifications from this app? And so it would be at that point that you think about making sure that that would include any marketing sort of push notifications that you want to send as well.
Thank you. That's great. So we're nearly out of time, but we just have had one question as well from Saeed about, will we be doing a webinar on the data use and access bill? We certainly will, and some comms that come out as well. So if you're not already following us on our LinkedIn page, you can find it on there. And if you're not signed up to our marketing, you can, but we will be posted on the Hello DPO LinkedIn page, and you can always reach out to us as well. Our contact details actually are at the end of the slide. So if you did want to reach out to any of the team, feel free to do so. If nobody else has anything to add, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.